much for my name is Sandra León. I'm a Ramón Areces visiting fellow at the European Studies Center. So I'm the host of this event. And I'm delighted to have with us Professor Peter Clegg. Welcome, Peter. Peter is head of the School of Social Sciences at the University of the West of England, where he also is Professor of Politics and International Relations. Peter's work has primarily focused on the Caribbean and the British overseas territories, as well as in the political economy of small states. He has held visiting positions in different universities around the world, in the Netherlands, in Jamaica, and he has a significant public impact record. He's worked with different governments and external organizations. And most importantly, he has published widely on governance, development, constitutional politics in small states and non-independent territories. He has also served on different editorial boards on academic journals. So welcome again, thank you, Peter. And joining him, we have Dr. David Garciandia. He's a teaching fellow in politics in Oriel College here, the University of Oxford, and founder and former president of the Oxford University Spanish Society. David works on EU law, international relations, with a strong focus on human rights and China. So David will be leading the conversation with Peter afterwards. So we will have Peter first presenting for around 30 minutes. Then this will be followed by a conversation interview between David and Peter. And later on, we'll open the discussion to the floor. So thanks again for being here. And David, I think you may want to say something about it.
Yes, just a few words. Yeah, to thank, of course, Peter for coming all the way from Bristol, especially in a cold day as today. And also thank to the European Studies Center, especially to Sandra for co-hosting this event, as well as to obviously the Oxford University Spanish Society and all the members here present for organizing this event, which is, well, quite a hot topic, especially in Spain in relation to Gibraltar. And I think a topic that is undergoing a lot of changes in recent years, mainly in relation to the Channel Islands, which is I think a less well-known case, but extremely important as well. So, well, to the floor, Peter. We are looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you. So echo my thanks for the invitation tonight. Thank you all for coming on a quite a bitter evening, and for those who are joining online as well. So the title of my presentation is, it will appear on the screen. See, there we go. Beyond the Rock and the Reef. So the rock, of course, refers to Gibraltar, and the reef, the Chagos Archipelago. So there are 14 overseas territories, 10 of which have British populations. The others are uninhabited, or in the case of the sovereign-based areas, Cypriot population in a British overseas territory. I'll talk about that in a little while. In the United Kingdom, the overseas territories don't get much traction necessarily, not much coverage in the press, unless there's a particular scandal, for example, or of course the hurricanes in the Caribbean and in the Caribbean overseas territory have significant impact. As we'll see, the territories are not colonies, although if you go back to some of the original legislation underpinning their status in relation to the UK, the colony is still there in the original legislation. But they're not colonies, and they would be quite resentful if you called them that. But they're not fully independent either. So they're in this sort of interesting sort of grey space in the international political system, where most have local democratic systems. They have significant autonomy, but ultimately, in terms of the international legal order, the UK has oversight and is responsible for what goes on within the territories. In terms of the sort of the title here, the transition. David's mentioned Chagos Archipelago, which is a very interesting case, which I'll talk about a little bit. Actually, the passage of the legislation is going through Westminster at the moment. It may be concluded by the end of the year or just into early next year, where, depending on your point of view, the archipelago is sort of returned to Mauritius, or it's a surrender of British territory back to the Mauritian government. The sort of the Brexit implications for the overseas territories, we're still sort of, what is it now? Well, almost 10 years on since the referendum, and 5-6 years since the treaty was signed, the exit treaty was signed with the European Union. Of course, when the referendum was held, we weren't aware of the full implications of Brexit, and certainly within the context of the overseas territories as well. And then there were ongoing discussions around the nature of governance within the territories, the balance of power between the local elected representatives in the territories and the UK government. And there's some interesting things happening, for example, in the British Virgin Islands at the moment, where the local government is quite upset about what's happening with the governor sacking the interim or acting police commissioner, for example, and making sure that actually the financial regulations in terms of borrowing, for example, in relation to the territories is quite constrained, although in reality, or in theory at least, territories have complete fiscal and economic autonomy. So that's sort of the general context of today's presentation. So just to, this is a bit small, hopefully you can see, at least get a sense of where all the overseas territories are located. So they're in the Caribbean, particularly South Atlantic, Indian Ocean, although maybe not for much longer, Europe and the Pacific, and also put in there, which we probably won't talk about too much, are the Crown dependencies. So Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, who have different histories, different relationships with the United Kingdom, but some of the challenges they face in terms of small size, in terms of the nature of their economies, for example, and their relationships with the United Kingdom are quite similar. And in one or two cases, when we talk about sort of offshore financial centres, and some of the discussions you might have seen around beneficial ownership, trying to open up the financial centres in terms of who actually benefits and who owns the assets within these financial centres. The Westminster Parliament has treated the overseas territories differently to the Crown dependencies. So still, at least for the next few months, the sun never sets on the British Empire, quoting John Crocker, who was a diplomat in the 19th century. And that's still, quite significant in this day and age. The United Kingdom still has that breadth of representation across the globe. As we've said, it may be 13 quite soon, with the Chagos Archipelago being returned to Mauritius, and this will end decades of dispute in relation to that issue. Although, as we'll see in a moment, the role of the former native population, the Chagosians, is probably the most controversial point in relation to the last parts of the negotiations. And of course, these territories are part of Britain's colonial legacy and history, and also through conquest. So Gibraltar was captured from Spain in 1704, ceded under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The Falkland Islands was claimed by the British in 1765, but of course that's since then a long-running dispute with Argentina over sovereignty. And of course within the Caribbean, the building of the colonies, slave trade and everything that came with that. Bermuda is the longest standing colony, although I should say in the West Atlantic, not in the Caribbean, going back to 1612. Some authors have said that the overseas territories are the last pink bits, which perhaps is not entirely sort of a polite way of highlighting them, but still this is sort of the legacy of empire, the legacy of Britain's colonial history. As we'll see, and as I've already mentioned, can be an uneasy relationship between the United Kingdom and its overseas territories. But there are significant aspects of strategic importance. So there are military bases on Diego Garcia, for example, and in Cyprus with the sovereign base areas. There's significant biodiversity across the overseas territory. So around over 90% of the UK's biodiversity is found across the overseas territories. And of course, they are, or some are, financial hubs, which do link in to the City of London. So there are advantages, and that's part of the sort of the rhetoric around the territories. What is the interest on the part of the United Kingdom to maintain these territories? And some of those issues are highlighted in that respect. And of course, the reasons why the territories themselves would like to retain their links with the United Kingdom as well. And I'll talk about a bit about that later on. So that's the geography. And again, hopefully you can see some of this. This is just some of the sort of the statistical aspects across the across the inhabited territories in this table. So some have very high per capita GDP, much higher than the United Kingdom. And that's quite an interesting issue in terms of when a hurricane hits, for example, how much financial support should the United Kingdom provide to the territories. Some have, and we're talking about relatively large populations, so Cayman Islands around 70,000, all the way down to Pitcairn at 40. Unsurprisingly, Pitcairn cannot sustain itself economically and receives around 90% of its budget from UK aid. And there is a longer term question when we talk about what might happen in the future around Pitcairn's sustainability with such a small population, such an isolated territory, and an aging population as well. So is there sort of the human capacity on Pitcairn territory operating? We've mentioned some of the key industries. So in the Caribbean, or some of the Caribbean overseas territories, financial services and tourism are all important. In the South Atlantic, fisheries and agriculture are key. But across most of these, you can see a few have budgetary aid from London, but most are self-sufficient economically. And this is something which the United Kingdom has strongly promoted. And as we've just mentioned in relation to the British Virgin Islands, make sure that the rules are in place so that self-sufficiency is not compromised. So this sometimes is a source of frustration on the part of the territories that they have significant economies. Many are well managed, but in terms of sort of longer term investment, it is a challenge to get that past the United Kingdom. Anguilla, just to say, is going through quite a positive economic position because of its AI domain name, which is bringing significant resource over the last few years. So in terms of sort of commonalities, yes, there's small climate risks, some reliant on UK aid, but also significant diversity in terms of population relatively and the size of their economies and their wealth. And in total, we're talking about around 270,000 people across the 10 territories. Now, this is the only question I'm going to ask you this evening. What is wrong with that picture? Won't keep you hanging for too long. But, do you see that little sort of doorway in the right-hand side salt mound? So this was the case until 1968. So this sort of illustrates the sometimes misunderstanding in terms of what the OTs are and what is done within them. So the Turks and Caicos Islands had a significant salt industry for many centuries, but somebody, possibly in the Foreign Office, wasn't quite sure about that. So they put a little door thinking it was an igloo, which of course is not quite geographically correct. So of course this is a historic example, but it just illustrates the fact that there is a degree of misunderstanding and misrepresentation in relation to the overseas territories. So of course, if you think of Pitcairn, you might think of the mutiny on the Bounty. If you think of St. Helena, it's where Napoleon was exiled. If you think of Gibraltar, it might be the monkeys. If you think of the Caribbean, it might be the financial centres. But actually, the reality is much more complex. Of course, it's much more complex in relation to the nature of governance, the legal systems tied to the UK, the strong local identities, and also the diversity within these territories. So the Falkland Islands, for example, I think has close to 50 different nationalities, population of 3,500 to 4,000. So again, the sort of the view of the United Kingdom population and how it views the territories is quite narrow and doesn't really do credit to everything that goes on within them. And of course, when there is media coverage, if you read the UK or foreign press, it's usually crisis driven. So when a hurricane hits, for example, one of the overseas territories, or when there's significant corruption scandals, or there are sovereignty disputes, as in relation to the Chagos Archipelago, Gibraltar, and the Falkland Islands. So let's get into a few of these cases in a bit more detail. And perhaps the most high-profile one and the most timely one is in relation to the Chagos Archipelago. And it's really interesting to go back into the history and, of course, the conflicting views about the origins of the dispute and also the recent legal rulings, which, do they require the UK to give back sovereignty or return sovereignty to Mauritius or not? So the Chagos Archipelago had some link with Mauritius going back to the start of the 1800s. It was informally or formally incorporated into Mauritius at the start of the 20th century. Now, there's significant distance between Mauritius and the Chagos Archipelago, but within the context of British colonial rule, the Chagos Archipelago were aligned to Mauritius. Now, after the end of the Second World War, with the Suez Crisis as well, the military bases that the United Kingdom had in this area and in the Mediterranean, of course, the Middle East were being, were under threat. So there was a retrenchment really on the part of the United Kingdom in terms of its military bases. And the United States were somewhat concerned about this, and they felt, how can we sustain UK-US interest in this sort of part of the world? So there were the sovereign base areas in Cyprus, of course, but in the Indian Ocean, let's try and sort of establish a base. And of course, ultimately they chose Diego Garcia, which was the largest island within the Chagos Archipelago. Now, the UK did this by separating the archipelago from Mauritius in 1965. In 1968, Mauritius gained independence, and the military base was established or started to be established from the early 1970s through to the 1980s and beyond. Of course, the Chagos Archipelago had an indigenous population, Garcians, and they were forcibly removed from the islands around this time to allow for security of the base. So after the early 1970s, there was no indigenous population across the Chagos Archipelago. So the way in which the United Kingdom established the British Indian Ocean Territory, as it was then called, is highly suspect in terms of separating territory prior to Mauritius gaining independence and the forcible removal of the indigenous population. And really from the 1980s onwards, Mauritius has undertaken a significant campaign to try and reclaim the territories for themselves. So even going back to the mid-1960s, there was a UN General Assembly resolution calling for the UK not to do what they were planning to do in terms of splitting the territory in this way. And it was made clear in some of the legal documents that once the use of the Chagos Archipelago, the use of Diego Garcia for military base, once that was over, then the territory would return to Mauritius. So there was a sense that this was sort of a temporary agreement, an arrangement, and ultimately Mauritius would again have the Chagos Archipelago. And in 1980, when Margaret Thatcher was talking about this issue, she was saying, in time, the Chagos Archipelago will revert back to Mauritius, indicating this was a temporary arrangement. And also at the same time, because early on the UK and the US were unsure which island to choose in terms of the military base. So they also removed a number of islands from Seychelles. But ultimately they decided not to use those islands and return those islands to Seychelles just prior to the Seychelles gaining independence in 1978. So from one sort of legal perspective, which seems to be the dominant one at the moment, all of those kinds of actions indicated what the UK was doing was probably not really legal and against international law. So the key decision was in 2019. So the International Court of Justice gave, admittedly, an advisory opinion saying that actually the way in which the British Indian Ocean Territory was established was against international law and had to be addressed. Then UN General Assembly resolutions supported that position. And then the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in 2021, and this didn't involve the UK, but this was a maritime boundary dispute between Mauritius and the Maldives, gave a ruling on the basis of the International Court of Justice ruling of 2019. And there have been other things such as UN maps have been redrawn to remove the UK sovereignty and ownership of the Chagos archipelago. And the Universal Postal Union has said that actually postal operations within the Chagos archipelago now lay with Mauritius and not with the United Kingdom. So, of course, even preceding the Labour government now in power in the UK, the Conservative government previously were also concerned about the legal weight of opinion that was building against UK sovereignty in relation to the Chagos archipelago. And there's feeling now, even though the Conservatives have sort of changed their tune a little bit in opposition, feeling is that, yes, even though the ICJ opinion was advisory, that has set a significant precedent. And Christopher Greenwood, a former ICJ judge, has called it a very authoritative ruling. So the concern is that if there is a final ruling in the international court setting, then there would be no time to make any adjustments to change the nature of sovereignty. So this is a preemptive act in the expectation that actually international law is building to such an extent that it would be very difficult for the UK to maintain its sovereignty, which of course would put at risk the military base, which is UK's present sovereign, but the US largely uses the base at the moment. So there's a sense that actually the military base will be compromised as a consequence of further international action. Now, some on the other side have criticised this as surrender, that you're overstating the importance of the ICJ ruling in 2019, but there is a sense that actually a change was needed, and this is the right thing to do. And as I said at the start, it's likely that this change will come in the next few months. And going back to the original reason why the British Indian Ocean Territory was established was to try and create some protective space for the base to operate. Now, with these present rulings, that protective area is being compromised. So actually the original reason for creating this particular overseas territory is being undermined or has been undermined by these rulings. So it's a really interesting example of some of the difficulties and tensions that are a legacy of British colonial rule in relation to the Chagos archipelago. Now, of course, as you might have seen in the press, there was a sense, well, if the Chagos goes, then what other territories which might still be associated with will the Falklands go next? Gibraltar, maybe the sovereign base areas. In my view, at least, that's sort of an overstated position. Chagos archipelago is a very particular example under international law. There's been no way the same scrutiny in relation to the other overseas territories. Arguably, the closest is the sovereign base areas in Cyprus. But there are some important differences. One, that there have been a series of updated agreements emphasizing that there is British sovereignty over this part of Cyprus in relation to the sovereign base areas. There was no forced displacement of the indigenous population. So actually, the only permanent population in the sovereign base areas are Cypriot. There are no international legal challenges. But interestingly, Cyprus did vote in favour of the UN General Assembly resolution regarding Chagos after the 2019 ICJ advisory opinion. So let's look at the sovereign base areas, and this case and Gibraltar are clearly have suffered as a consequence of Brexit. So Gibraltar was discussed a little bit in 2015, 2016 around the Brexit referendum, but certainly not the sovereign base areas in Cyprus. And for sort of convenience and not to sort of antagonize the Cypriots too much, in normal language, they're called the British bases. So the word sovereign doesn't really appear in the discussions because it's a bit of a red rag to a bull argument. So within the sovereign base areas, there's Akrotiri, which hosts an RAF base and is key for Middle East operations and intelligence. So the attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, for example, last year emanated from the sovereign base areas, and Dikalia provides logistical and communication support. There are 11,000 Cypriots living in the sovereign based areas, but no permanent British population. British population is relating to primarily the base and a few police officers, civilian police officers in the sovereign based areas. And it's interesting that at the time of Brexit, basically there was a protocol to the withdrawal treaty, which sort of established the arrangements. And in essence, you have sort of not, well, you do have sovereignty, British sovereignty, but in many ways it's quite nominal. So, but EU law applies in most respects. So, in terms of customs, in terms of taxation, and in terms of the free movement of people, all goods in and out of the sovereign based areas are through Cyprus. Cypriot legislation is followed. Cypriots in the sovereign based areas vote in Cypriot elections. Most land in there is privately owned by Cypriots, and the ancient monuments in that area are managed and administered by Cyprus. So it's a really interesting and quite a quirky arrangement where you have sovereignty basically in relation to giving some security for the bases, but actually the day-to-day operation, the nature of life in that part of Cyprus is pretty much similar to anyone living in Cyprus more generally. And then there's Gibraltar, which of course had, during the UK's membership of the EU, had an open, relatively open border. So Gibraltar was not part of the Schengen area. It wasn't part of the customs union, but it had many other benefits of EU membership. And the EU often acted as a sort of a neutral interlocutor when there were tensions between Gibraltar and Spain in relation to the border. And this open border is mutually beneficial. So 15,000 Spanish workers come across the border each day. So there's significant employment, economic benefits for that area of Spain, but also for the well-being and development of the Gibraltar economy, significantly reliant on a Spanish workforce. And again, Gibraltar has a Royal Navy base strategically located, of course, in the entrance to the Mediterranean. So the problem was with Brexit, and Gibraltar wasn't included in the withdrawal agreement, what would happen to the border? So there was a very provisional agreement which kept the border open, but that couldn't last forever. So again, the Conservatives started the conversation with Spain about the arrangements, and over the last few months, a provisional agreement has been reached between the UK and Spain, but also crucially with the voice of Gibraltar involved in those negotiations. And you could argue possibly this is the last piece of the EU Brexit puzzle. So basically, as a way of keeping that border open, the plan is to have joint border checks, not at the existing border, but actually anybody entering Gibraltar. So this was quite a controversial issue. Could you have sort of Spanish border guards checking papers, people entering Gibraltar, and then they could move freely into Spain? So the idea that there's sort of a double check, have Gibraltarian and Spanish checks at the same time in terms of the Gibraltar port and airport. But that means actually that Gibraltar is now probably more integrated into Europe and into Spain than at any time before. And they're now also talking about having some kind of customs union, which of course previously Gibraltar was exempted from. Now, of course, some of the rhetoric on the right was quite strong. It was a betrayal, it was surrender, it was a sellout. Mark Francois on the Conservative benches, I quite like this quote. He said, "First Chagos, now Gibraltar, and next probably the Falklands. Labour used to sing the red flag, now they just wave a big white one instead." But again, the practicalities and realities of the sort of awkward kinds of relationships have to be dealt with. Otherwise, there'll be a closed border. It's not the first time it's happened. So Franco, from the late 60s to the early 80s, there was a closed border, which caused Gibraltar significant concerns and problems. And of course, the UK has always had a bit of a, not always a fully supportive relationship with Gibraltar. So in 2002, for example, the UK government under Tony Blair tried to negotiate with Spain a joint sovereignty agreement. Gibraltar was very much opposed to that, held its own referendum, and those proposals fell by the wayside. But this agreement, if it passes, I think the finer details are still being worked on, will hopefully, again, solve another, at least to an extent, another international issue and legacy of colonialism. So both Gibraltar and the sovereign base areas are really interesting cases within Europe about sort of the unintended consequences and impacts and challenges after Brexit was achieved. Just finally on this, in relation to the Falklands, I should say. So the Falklands, of course, is nowhere near Europe, but under UK's membership of the EU, the overseas territories gained free access into the EU market and also free movement of people. The Falklands provide significant fisheries exports into Spain, particularly squid. And after the withdrawal agreement, tariffs were placed on Falklands exports of squid into Spain, had a detrimental impact on their economy. So again, even as far away as the Falkland Islands, Brexit had an unintended consequence, and they're trying to negotiate and trying to lobby the UK to deal with that particular issue, and maybe in the future there'll be some success. So you could argue that even with Brexit, there has been a growing Europeanization almost in relation to Gibraltar and the sovereign base areas. Now, within all of this context is the issue of self-determination. So yes, certainly the larger, more economically successful territories have their own parliamentary systems, their own democracies. They have significant autonomy as a consequence. But there's always that tension and conflict, sometimes between what the UK wants, perhaps in relation to their international legal obligations when it comes, for example, to the legalization of homosexuality or the recognition of civil partnerships, whereas locally they might not want those things to happen. The third picture there is the recent swearing in of the new governor of Bermuda. And you might say that that kind of garb is not necessarily that representative of the 21st century, but that's the kind of thing that's done. And the governor still has quite significant authority, although when they use that authority, it can be very controversial, as you might expect within the overseas territories. So the governor is appointed by the United Kingdom with no engagement, really, no voice, no vote on the part of the overseas territory. So the governor is responsible to the Secretary of State, probably indirectly by the Parliament in Westminster, but not in the local territory. And they are responsible for so-called reserve matters, which include defence, external affairs, and internal security. And also, although not in all cases, they have the power to legislate, so they can directly legislate in certain contexts. They can withhold assent to local legislation. In essence, they would say, okay, we're not sure about this. We're going to let the Secretary of State and officials in London decide whether this is appropriate legislation to pass locally or not. And they can actually disallow legislation as well. This is not in all cases. So Bermuda, for example, which arguably has the most advanced constitutional settlement, because there was a sense that in time they would move to independence, which of course they've never done. In Bermuda case, the governor can't legislate, but in many of the others she can. So there's a sense maybe of a democratic deficit here of the role of the governor not being accountable to the local overseas territory. And there have been a couple of interesting examples where the governor has become involved. So Bermuda passed legislation to legalize cannabis. The governor withheld assent, and the Secretary of State in London said, no, this goes against our international anti-narcotic obligations. So this was prevented going forward within Bermuda. And also in relation to the Cayman Islands, there was a court ruling in Cayman on the importance of recognizing same-sex relationships. There was an agreement that same-sex marriage was not appropriate because they were following the lead of European Convention or the European Court of Human Rights, which has ruled, I believe, that same-sex marriage is not a requirement in terms of EU law, but civil partnerships are. So there was a ruling in the local Caymanian court that actually civil partnerships were appropriate within the context of sort of human rights legislation. The local parliament refused to legislate, so the governor said, okay, if you're not doing it, I am. So the governor legislated for that change fairly recently, and of course that didn't go down too well within the context of the local overseas territory. So there are these tensions in terms of what can we do locally as an overseas territory and what the United Kingdom feels is appropriate in regard to its international obligations. And over the years, there has been a diminution of the UK power, but there are certain red lines beyond which the UK is not prepared to go because they feel internationally we're legally responsible. So we need some kind of mechanism, the legal mechanisms to help us deal with issues if we're ultimately responsible for the international community. The second issue is corruption, and the flip side of that, good governance. So there have been, over the years, significant examples of corruption within the overseas territories. In the late 1980s, for example, the entire financial sector of Montserrat was closed down because of concerns around money laundering and so forth. Then in the mid-1980s, in the Turks and Caicos Islands, the British government had to take full control over the territories after the Prime Minister, or Premier, Chief Minister, I think, sorry, at the time, was arrested in the United States on drug trafficking charges and was subsequently served a sentence in Florida. And then there was another corruption scandal in the Turks and Caicos Islands around Michael Missick, who was accused of basically significant corruption, filtering away hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think his trial is still ongoing. Makes a mockery really of the judicial process because these allegations were sort of first raised 15 years ago. So the judicial process in relation to that case is taking an inordinate amount of time. And then more recently, 3 or 4 years ago, there were significant concerns about governance in the British Virgin Islands. There was a commission of inquiry. So the governor, through UK government, appointed a commission of inquiry to investigate the nature of the activities there. And these were some of the quotes from the British BVI Commission Inquiry report from 2022. Awarding of contracts, the principles of governance were almost entirely ignored. Good governance is shunned by elected officials as an unwelcome stranger. And that elected officials were clearly aware of what they were doing. Now, in the previous examples of significant and pretty systemic corruption, the UK government took control, but not in this case. So Liz Truss was the Foreign Secretary, and she said, actually, we'll give you the authority to make the changes required, but we'll have an ordering council, which is the mechanism by which the UK can legislate for the overseas territories. In our back pocket, we'll keep that. So if you don't sort of make good progress, we will then take direct control and impose these changes ourselves. I should also say at the same time as the Commission of Inquiry, similar to what happened in the Turks and Caicos Islands in the mid-1980s, the Premier, Andrew Foy, was accused and convicted of importing cocaine to the United States and money laundering, and he's now serving time in a federal prison. So again, for the United Kingdom, this is a bit of a international legal headache to try and deal with these issues, which have international legal implications. Nevertheless, the BVI have largely put in place the changes required from the Commission of Inquiry, and now they're agitating for the new constitution and moving towards either fuller self-government or possibly independence. Now, of course, the United Nations still has a list of territories which it feels have not yet fully decolonized. So that there's 17 territories on that list. And all of them, well, the vast majority of them are UK territories, including the Falklands, Gibraltar, and the British Virgin Islands. So in the UN sense, even though these territories have significant autonomy, because the United Kingdom has certain expectations in terms of how the territories are governed, that goes against the sort of the spirit and international law in terms of the process of how self-governance should take place. In essence, the territory themselves should decide the kind of relationship they would have with the metropolitan power, rather than, in this case, the UK determining certain aspects of that relationship. Now, of course, since 1983 and some Kitts and Nevis gained independence within the Caribbean, at least, no other English-speaking territory has followed suit. And it would be interesting when I sort of look to the future, whether it's likely that any of these territories, particularly in the Caribbean, might achieve independence in the next decade or two. So in terms of the issue of self-determination, having significant and quite deep-seated examples of corruption doesn't sort of bode well to the sort of the political and democratic responsibility of these territories in order to establish themselves as fully functioning democracies. And of course, in the BVI, the population is 35,000. Everybody knows each other. So the idea that there's and this is a sort of a concern about the sort of the imposition of the Westminster system on a territory which is so small. So, you know, you have an executive, you have the legislature, you have, in theory, an independent civil service, you have some audit mechanisms, but actually, do those things really work? Can you sort of transpose a system which applies to the UK to a much smaller territory? And there's been some discussion around that. Another issue within this context is beneficial ownership. So as I mentioned at the start, the idea that in terms of financial holdings, you should know who has those financial interests. And there's been, there was legislation passed in 2018, I think, in Westminster, requiring the overseas territories to make this change. They protested, they said this was constitutional overreach, this was unfair, this was colonialism at its very worst. They've had a rearguard action to try and prevent this from happening, but slowly and surely they're doing it, but they're saying, actually, we're not going to have publicly accessible lists. It's those with legitimate interests, so maybe journalists or other stakeholders in the financial services sector. So again, this is another interesting example of sort of the clash between the UK and the territories when it comes to governance. And finally, central migrant processing centres. So this was a plan, it didn't go very far, but this was a plan under Priti Patel when she was Home Secretary. and I think it's been raised more recently by Nigel Farage, that if we're trying to remove asylum seekers from the United Kingdom, where can we put them? So one example, and this is the picture, the first picture is Ascension Island. So there's some discussion that actually asylum seekers could be placed in certain overseas territories. And of course, again, that doesn't necessarily go down too well with those living in the territories, and they see that as high-handedness. And just finally, before we look to the future, of course, the UK still has a significant influence within the territories. Westminster can legislate for the territories, as it did in regard to beneficial ownership. So should the territories have a voice at Westminster? Should they have an MP or more than one MP? Should they have representatives in the House of Lords? Gibraltar have sort of discussed this a little bit. Some Conservative MPs have said this should happen because it's wrong that Westminster can legislate, but you don't have the representatives of the OTs in that place. But largely, the territories have said no, because they fear that with that would create greater UK interest, greater UK engagement. So if you're talking about their financial services industry, would that mean taxation perhaps could be asked for from the UK government? So generally, they've said no to this, and there are other ways of influence. So there are all-party groups. Next week, there's the Joint Ministerial Council. So UK ministers, officials meet with all of the UK OT representatives in London for high-level discussions. There's also something called the United Kingdom Overseas Territories Association in London, where you have the OT representatives being close to Westminster, lobbying MPs, going to party political conferences, and so forth. So it's an interesting area. And of course, we talk about some of the French territories in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, some of the smaller Dutch territories on air. They have representation in the national metropolitan parliament. And I think because of the different nature of the relationship between the UK and the OTs, the idea of representation, even though quite an interesting one, probably doesn't have significant legs. So we've sort of travelled far and wide. We've looked at Chagos, we've looked at Gibraltar, the sovereign base areas, we looked at autonomy, self-governance. What might happen in the next 10 to 20 years? The flippant answer might be not much at all. So actually, yes, there are disagreements. Yes, there are subtle changes in relations, but actually, since Hong Kong, which was another overseas territory, left and returned to China in 1997, until the Chagos situation today, nothing has fundamentally changed in relation to the number of territories or the nature of governance between the UK and the OTs. So that's sort of the flippant shorter answer. But the more nuanced answer could be, well, certainly the Chagos archipelago will go, but its wider importance for the other overseas territories is certainly be overstated. There will certainly be fallings out, and tensions will continue between the UK and its expectations and what the local government wants. Will there be independence? So this is a really interesting one. Often the rhetoric at a particular time of local election within the territory say, yes, we want independence. We want to sort of shake off this colonial sort of system. But when it comes to it, they don't do it. I suspect that there won't be any cases of independence over the next 20 years. If one tries it, it will probably mean that the others will be even less in favour of doing it, but we'll see. So I think that's unlikely. There'll be still some discussions about can greater autonomy be given with an increasingly narrow sort of range of options and possibilities. Will the UK government's attitude toward the OTs change? Now, over the last 30 years, there's been a general consensus across Conservative and Labour governments that actually we support the territories and we would not force them to move to independence. That attitude in terms of Labour changed a little bit under Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader, much more critical, particularly around offshore financial services and the territories. But generally, I think the British government's view, Labour Conservative, Labour reform in the future would be largely supported. What about the sovereign base areas? So potentially, and this is interesting, if Cyprus unites, whether there would be more focus on the position of the sovereign base areas within Cyprus. So potentially, the UK could give up more of the land around the bases, which is quite a lot, and have a more focused interest in Cyprus. Of course, I haven't talked about today much about climate change and threats of security more generally. Pitcairn, around its sustainability, it's increasingly difficult to see Pitcairn surviving really as a territory in the next 20 to 30 years. And also that focus of Europeanization. So some of you may have been to Gibraltar, some of you may have been to the sovereign base areas. So even though there is, of course, symbols of Britishness, reality is the strength of the Spanish culture, Spanish language, Spanish workers in Gibraltar, the dominance of Cypriots within the sovereign base areas. You can see over time that sort of influence is gaining strength and may have some sort of impact on sovereignty and governance going forward. So that's a slightly more nuanced answer, but in general, just sum up, it's a really fascinating sort of topic, as hopefully you can sort of understand and appreciate, at least for me. The legacy of the empire, colonialism, trying to establish themselves in the modern world, their vulnerability, their focus on certain industries, which potentially are quite controversial in the international system, all leads to quite an interesting and nuanced picture. So in terms of what next, well, we'll wait and see, and perhaps you can invite me back in 20 years' time to see what's happened.
We will.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This fascinating presentation in which we have, you have tapped into so many different topics: governance, self-determination, international law. Like, it's been really, really rich and interesting. And there's so many questions that I have. So first, David, maybe you want to start. I think that you leave me a couple of minutes to make
definitely.
We move to the discussion to the floor.
So I also have many questions, but I'm going to resist the temptation of asking all of them. And I'll just want to make a first comment and then raise two topics. So the first comment is, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation, especially because it was very grounded in normative terms. You mentioned international law a lot, which is something that nowadays, is not happening. Like right now, it seems that interest, right, and hard power is overshading international law nowadays. And well, this world based on rules, institutions, multilateralism apparently is fading that way. So in that sense, I really appreciate that, and I hope that in this spirit, the UK follows international law in the future as well. And as it has been doing, at least partially during the last probably 2 centuries, keeps on strengthening and advancing international law, and doesn't subject international law to its own interests. So that's more a comment and a hope for the future. Then I would like just to raise two fronts. The first one is about this idea of the beneficial partnership or relationship between the United Kingdom and these British overseas territories. Because I have been reading and I see more and more often this idea that some of these territories are becoming like free riders. They are sort of, developing their own laws, and they are absorbing resources from the UK in a sense, but they are not contributing to the general treasury of the UK, right? Especially a few days ago, for example, there was a report in the House of Commons here in the UK about gambling issues, which is a point very important for Gibraltar. And I hear this argument more and more often that Gibraltar has specialized as this sort of gambling hub in the world, and is attracting a lot of resources, not only from Spain in terms of lower taxes, so companies moving into Gibraltar and paying less taxes in Spain, but also from the UK, right? So this is one of the traditional criticisms from the Spanish side. I remember our Spanish Minister of Finance in 2014, Mr. Montor, he said that Gibraltar absorbs up to €1 billion per year in taxes not paid in Spain, which may be an exaggeration. Other reports that I have seen, they say it's more about 200 million, 300, but still we're talking about millions of euros. But it's not only the Spanish side, it's also the UK side. we see these companies like Bet365, Ladbrokes, William Hill, all these big betting companies, online betting companies, that they moved away from London to Gibraltar in order to pay less taxes. So I start seeing this argument of, well, it's true that Gibraltar is draining resources from us as well, right? It's not only about the Spaniards complaining always about this dimension of Gibraltar, but it is also present in the UK. So I don't know if you can give a bit your opinion or how you see this situation, and if this is becoming solid in the UK, or it's just still a minority within national opinion.
So it's the case that as operating in these grey areas of international law and international political economy. So the idea you have safeguards of UK democracy, you have the English legal system, which provides security for investors, but you have that degree of autonomy outside of immediate UK norms. Although, of course, you could say that, excuse me, the City of London doesn't have the best reputation in terms of financial transparency and probity. And those who are from the territories would argue, well, we're easy targets for such criticism. We're small. We don't have much significance of power in the international system, and we're easy targets. So why not focus on the City of London? Why not focus on Luxembourg or Switzerland or parts of the United States, which also have quite lax taxation systems? But it's true that if the territories do feel that's why they don't want representation, it means to compromise that at the moment, quite useful position.
Not taxation without representation.
That's right. So I think the deal with over Gibraltar that's just been signed, I think there's an attempt to try and close some of those gaps around gambling, around tobacco, and smuggling, which I think is also an issue. So the fact that there's a closer alignment, or will be in the future, between Gibraltar, Spain, and European Union more generally, I think there will be an attempt, at least by the European Union, Spain, to reduce some of these perceived advantages Gibraltar presently has.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I actually had some data here in my laptop, but it died, right? But I do remember some of the data, and in the last year, I think it was from January to September 2025, there were like somewhere around 850 companies, new companies incorporated in Gibraltar, where the population increase, the average across the last 10 years has been just 500 people, counting both birth and immigration in Gibraltar, which is the population is around 35,000 people, 40,000 people, something like that. And they have around like 60,000 companies incorporated in Gibraltar, out of which, according to official data of the government, 18,000 are active, right? So it seems that it is becoming a financial hub, tax haven, some would say. But let me just move here to the second front. As a lawyer, I said that I would resist the temptation of asking many questions, but I cannot resist the temptation of asking some legal elements of the discussion. So when we structure these decolonization processes, especially under UN law, we have two main principles according to which this can be done. It can be done according to the idea of self-determination, which is what you explained, or according to the idea of territorial integrity. For example, what the UK did with China in relation to Hong Kong. We have an expert in Hong Kong here in the room. The idea being that if one of the main elements is that if the original population was forcibly removed from there and it was replaced by new population, then the idea of self-determination doesn't make much sense, because who do you ask for the vote, right? I mean, who would be the eligible voters in such a referendum to determine the future of Gibraltar or any other country, right? And in the particular case of Gibraltar, there was a bilateral agreement between the both crowns of the country, the Spanish one and the British one, in which, by the way, sovereignty was never ceded. So I pulled out the 300-year-old treaty, and I just like to read a few sentences here, right, where it says that the Catholic King does hereby for himself, his heirs and successors, yield to the Crown of Great Britain the full and the entire property, so the ownership of the town and castle of Gibraltar, together with the port, which is not the same as the harbor, by the way, it's the infrastructure, fortifications and forts, and then it says it should be enjoyed absolutely with all manner of right for forever. But the above mentioned property yielded to Great Britain without any territorial jurisdiction and without any open communication by land with the country round about. Anyways, I don't want to get very much into these details, but the idea being that the UN has been consistently saying that in the case of Gibraltar, if it were to decolonize, it should be around the idea of territorial integrity. So a bilateral agreement between the crown, between both crowns actually, the one in the UK and the one in Spain. There are many legal elements that I don't want to go into, but it seems that there is a problem here, right? Because if you want to structure that process around the idea of territorial integrity, which is somehow similar to what is going on in the Chagos Islands, you should give the territory back to the original owner, or even the still sovereign country, which Spain claims to be Spain. But then what do you do with the local population, right? You need to some extent to listen to their voices, which is something that, again, in Hong Kong, it was not done, in other places, it's not been done. So the idea here being, or the question, what is the way forward here? So if there was to be a decolonization process in relation to Gibraltar, done according to this principle of territorial integrity, which makes sense under international law and in historical terms, what do you do about the population? How do you solve that complex situation?
It's almost, it's intractable because the two aspects are difficult to bring together. Of course, the Falklands and certain Falklands and probably Gibraltar say, well, we are decolonized. In terms of our view, we have said in referenda that our preference is with the UK. That's our voice in terms of self-determination. Now, of course, that's not recognised internationally necessarily, but in terms of the local residents, they believe that process has happened. Interestingly, of course, around the Chagossians, there has been some talk about having a referendum around the present deal. Again, how do you do that? So is it the 300 to 400 remaining Chagossians that were removed in the late 1960s, early 70s? You include second, third generation Chagossians. What kind of questions do you ask? So that's not really an issue. And of course, about territorial integrity, that's what the UN General Assembly said in 1965. That's what the International Court of Justice has said in 2019, that actually, very unfortunate for the Chagossians, but actually you have to look at territorial integrity first. That means Chagos Islands are part of Mauritius, and then you deal with the issue of the population. So it is a very difficult and unfortunate situation for Chagossians because they are almost secondary concerns under international law. But it is an agreement between the UK and Mauritius, not involving Chagossians directly. So I think the Chagos example illustrates also the difficulties within Gibraltar and the Falklands, where yes, the views of the local population, if there is a local population, and the demands of international law, they just don't dovetail together.
And there is just a final comment. Another internal problem from the UK perspective, I think, when it comes to Gibraltar, because in the Treaty of Utrecht, Spain has a preferential right to acquire Gibraltar if the UK was to change its legal status to transfer it, which would happen if the ownership of Gibraltar passed from the hands of the crown into the hands of the current Gibraltarians. Because that would have been a change in the legal status in which Spain has a preferential right to acquire. So that also has some limitations in order to structure the constitutional identity of Gibraltar within the English legal system.
And that's why the 2002 agreement was seen to be the thin end of the wedge for Gibraltarians, because joint sovereignty, well, that's probably likely in the future going to involve sole sovereignty for Spain.
Well, so I'm not going to use my privilege because I think that we don't have so much time. So if we have time, I'll, present my questions, but I'd like the floor to give the floor, the opportunity to make some questions to the speaker. So there have been so many interesting questions raised during the presentation and the comments from David. So who wants to start?
Yeah, thank you. And let me just echo the two comments from your the people next to you that this was an excellent presentation, so thank you. And it opened my eyes to something that I want to follow more about in the future. But on Chagos, I just wanted to ask you if you could clarify a little bit more the military base on what framework will that be managed going forward. I presume the US and UK want to keep using the base. Yes. But Mauritius now obviously is going to have a big say in that. Would you say a bit more of that? Good question, yes. Perhaps I should have said a little bit more of that even later now. So yes, so the idea that Mauritius would lease back the base to the United States and the UK for 99 years at least. And I think there's an additional 40 years on top of that, and maybe further along the line. And the UK would pay, I think, £100 million a year for the privilege. And then you've got various agreements in terms of, yes, allowing the Chagosians possibly to come back to some of the outer islands, but you've got sort of security guarantees. So one of the arguments is, is China going to be a more significant threat? In my view, that's probably an overstated view, because actually India is the more significant sort of power and influence in that part of the world. But I think within 24 miles, there should be no sort of development. After 24 miles, there could be some agreements if the UK and the US agree to that. So yeah, they're trying to sort of lock in the security of the base, provide that wider geographical security, but ultimately give Mauritius back full control, full sovereignty of those islands. And it's interesting, of course, prior to the agreement, everybody thought that Donald Trump and the Trump administration would be vehemently against this. But the ins and outs of their view have not been revealed. But the fact that they've agreed to this deal signifies both that they're happy with the arrangements and also very conscious of the international legal challenges and what that implication might be. So in a nutshell, those are the kinds of arrangements going forward. Right. Just follow up. You said that the US is the main user of the base. Do you know anything about the agreement between the US and the UK? If there is one, the UK obviously pays for the continued use of that base, but it's in practice mostly being used by the US. So yes, so I think that's a very small number, just a few dozen UK personnel on the Igal Garcia, largely populated by US service personnel, largely paid for by the US as well in terms of the infrastructure, the logistics, and all of that. So yes, it's at least UK's sovereign, but really it's the sort of the US to use significantly. And of course, I don't think it's ever been proven necessarily, but there were accusations that after the Second Gulf War, the Igal Garcia was used for rendition on a couple of occasions. So again, that sort of indicates sometimes a tension there between UK sovereignty, but the US actually using the base primarily.
Thank you very much. Very clear and very interesting. I wanted to ask you, so I think you've identified, if I understood correctly, maybe one factor in terms of this loosening of the territories has been international law in the Chagos Island case. Has been, I don't think if this is correct, but in the case of Hong Kong, having a superpower like China on the other side of the table, and maybe this imbalancing between now the power that the UK has and the power that China has. So this imbalance of the actors play. Looking ahead, as you said, maybe status quo but do you think there could be another factor there that could change that question? And in particular, I was in Malvinas in January, and I think one thing that I saw, it was like this, as you mentioned, like this lack of infrastructure, this lack of investment, maybe in terms of a territory that now has much more wealth. But you can see in the case of Malvinas, for example, the internet provider, there was a ban on Starlink on the Elon Musk company, and the internet is awful. And you have a monopoly by the local authority and works terribly, and people complain a lot about that issue. So I don't know, maybe if the promise of a better life, in the case of Malvinas, joined with Argentina, which could be made difficult in this case. But in other territories, that could be one factor in terms of the improvement due to the lack of attention or investment by the British government, or any other factor that you think.
Let's try to
Sorry.
try to take more questions, and then we pack them. Peter can respond to them at the same time. So, any other question? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the topic. It was very interesting. I just have one question of what you mentioned of like the arguments that the overseas territories didn't want to have representation in parliament because of that they might tax them. And my question is like, I mean, because for me, like that idea is like I feel that UK also benefits from some of these overseas territories not being like tax havens, right? They benefit a lot, right? And then my question is like, could the UK right now, because with the governor and the ability of the government to legislate, could they legislate so these overseas territories would stop being tax havens right now? And do you think that's a good argument that if they have more representation, that would mean that they will tax them when there's also a benefit? There's a benefit, right?
And a final question. Yes.
I'm curious to hear a very brief comparative of the French case, maybe what the US also has in Pacific Island. Generally, how you see the different challenges and the shared ones.
So in terms of SDUs, Mount Venus there, not talking islands. I think that the attitude of the local population is so strong that despite those issues of concern, the link with the United Kingdom remains very strong. I mean, interestingly, that before the Falklands War, there was discussions about possibly handing Falklands back. And of course, the war stopped that in its tracks. Talked about sort of other influences, probably not other influences, but a deepening influence is around the legacy of Brexit. So because the UK was a member of the EU, in the treaty paperwork, it was always the Falkland Islands and the UK sovereignty over the Falklands. Now, recently, the EU has started to use Falklands/Malvinas. So again, sort of the ramifications and sort of the aftershocks of Brexit are in some ways, subtle ways, weakening sort of the international view of UK sovereignty over the Falklands and Gibraltar to an extent. In terms of, yes, in theory, the UK could legislate to end their tax haven, if you would call it that, status. Now, of course, that would cause absolute uproar in the overseas territories. They may think, okay, our only option is to go for independence. But in theory, UK Parliament is sovereign and have the right to legislate in all respects. So yes, in theory, they could do it. I mean, the downside of that is, of course, for many countries in the Caribbean, financial services are a significant income stream, and it helps them to be economically self-sufficient. So if that was removed, what other economic activities could they engage in? Or would that mean greater budgetary support from UK? And whether UK taxpayers would be prepared to do that, possibly not. And that links into the final question, actually, in terms of one difference, or others, which I'll mention in a minute. One difference is the French government and the EU provide billions of euros of support into the French territories, for example. UK has taken a different model, saying you largely have to be economically self-sustained, which is an interesting difference. And of course, there's more autonomy for the British territories compared to the French territories. And then when you look at the Dutch territories or the US territories, they're probably somewhere in between. So I think there is a sort of a scale of control, of autonomy between those. And of course, the greatest level of autonomy, arguably, is in relation to New Zealand and the Cook Islands and Niue, where they are completely autonomous, except for defence guarantees. So that's why under UN law, they are considered to be fully decolonised, because they decided to establish that freely associated status. with New Zealand. So yeah, there are some commonalities, but actually quite a lot of difference between how all of these territories are governed.
Okay, so we are, well about the assigned time. It's been really a pleasure, Peter, to hear you, to get to know more about these fascinating topics. You made it very, very fascinating even for people who have not explored these issues in the past. Though I see a lot of connections actually to my own research on self-determination, autonomy, decentralization. So that was very interesting. So thank you very much for being here with us, and see you next time. Thank you. You made the topic.